Galicia is a province in the north of Spain, sitting just north of Portugal, and it was one of the last places the Romans conquered to incorporate into their province of Hispania. However, Galicia still today has a very Celtic character, and in this video I want to particularly look at one place in Galicia, Lugo, where this ancient past is still very much felt to this day. If you've not seen them yet, I'd recommend taking a look at my other videos in this series on Iron Age Spain. In one of them I talked about the different cultures that existed there, and in the previous one I talked about the entire Roman conquest of Hispania, which spanned several centuries. But in this one I'd like to quickly go over the conquest of Galicia, specifically this area in the north, the creation of a new province in that area, and also of a very important and special city that is still found there today, the city of Lugo, and where the etymology of this name comes from. Various peoples that we would now call Celtic used to live in large parts of what is today Spain and Portugal, including in the region of what is now Galicia, and in fact the region gets its name from one of these groups that was called something like the Callaicus by the Romans. They would later take over this name for the entire province, although these were related to many of the other groups, often fighting against other tribes in the area, and the Callaicus themselves were also made up of lots of different factions and groups. Now this area in particular, and extending down into what is today Portugal, became known as the Castro Culture, and as I talked about in my other videos, the Castro Culture is named after the Latin word Castrum, which is like a fortified town or centre, and that's because there were lots of different fortified areas, oppida as they're called, or hill forts, that sprang up in this area on well defended mountain tops and on tops of hills and other places like this, as there was very frequent warfare between these various groups. Now they often fought against the Romans as well, and just as with the entirety of Hispania, the Romans didn't conquer Galicia in one go, but there were many different Roman expeditions there, and many times when the Galicians would come out of their mountain fastness to come and raid the Romans, or people allied to the Romans. And so the first time when the Romans really looked to go back and to fight against the Galicians in their own soil, they've already fought against tribes that came from Galicia in other wars when they were fighting against peoples like the Lusitanians and the Cantabrians, etc. The first time the Romans went to Galicia was in 137 BC under the leadership of Decimus Junius Brutus, who with his soldiers marched to the north and in fact crossed further into that area than ever before by crossing the river Limia. However, his troops were very scared of doing this, and as the story goes, they thought this was a river of death, and so Junius had to first cross the river himself, wading over it and then entering into what is now Galicia, and his soldiers followed suit, and this would be the first time that the Roman legionaries had gone this far north in this part of the Iberian Peninsula. And what's interesting is that if we look at archaeological remains from a hill fort in this area where we know that the Romans were, in Cividade de Torosso, we actually see that there is evidence of burning from just around this time, from around 137 BC, when we know that the Roman legions were active in the area to quell many of the raiding parties that were coming south. What's further interesting is that in Torosso we also see that after it has been burnt to the ground there is another layer of habitation, but that many of the buildings being built afterwards are clearly and heavily influenced by Roman architectural styles. So this might give an insight into the period of Romanization, and how even though this area wasn't formally a part of the Roman Empire, there was already Roman influence there even before they had been conquered by the Roman legions. And after his triumphant return, Decimus Junius Brutus became known as Decimus Junius Brutus Callaicus, the Roman name for the Galicians, because of his military victories in that area. There was probably more fighting there around 73 BC during the Sertorian War, which was a kind of civil war between various Roman factions, in which Sertorius himself actually went to the Iberian Peninsula and fought there against the central Roman government. But we definitely know that there was more Roman activity in Galicia in 61 BC with Julius Caesar, and part of the reason why was because he was propraetor, which is basically the governor of Hispania Ulterior, one of the Roman provinces in Hispania itself, and he was in need of money because he was in serious debt. And one way that he actually did this to get out of debt was to become good friends with Marcus Licinius Crassus, a very, very rich man back in Rome. But another way was to rally the troops that he had garrisoning the towns in Hispania Ulterior, and he also went on expeditions to the north, to those unconquered areas, and attacked several hill forts, including one which is still famous today at Elvinha, just to create this wealth and to pay off his debts so that he could go back to Hispania Ulterior and to become richer, and obviously afterwards he would need this money for his own bids for power. What's interesting is that these Roman encounters at Elvinha are mirrored in later ones as well during the Napoleonic Wars, where there was a large battle between the British and the French had the better of it in the Peninsular Campaign. Now, one reason why this was a particularly sound move for someone who was wanting to amass a bit of wealth is because the rivers in that part of Galicia have a lot of gold in them. And as such, the people were also very well known as craftsmen, as jewelers and metalsmiths, and so they knew there was a lot of wealth amassed inside these hill forts, which they could take. While Julius Caesar and his legionaries were more out to enrich themselves rather than conquering new land for the empire in the Iberian Peninsula, this did occur in 29 BC during the reign of Emperor Augustus, and it was in this time that he fought against the Cantabrian and Asturian tribes in Cantabria and Asturias in the north of Spain in what became known as the Cantabrian Wars. But it's very likely, based on some of the written evidence, as well as some evidence on the ground, that there was also fighting and military presence in the neighbouring region of Galicia as well. And it's thought that here in 13 BC, the Roman general Paulus Fabius Maximus departed from the Roman port city of Porto, today in Portugal, and marched north into Galicia, and there created a Roman army camp at Lugo. Now, this was likely already an inhabited site rather than being a new site, as I'll get onto in just a second. And the interesting thing is that even after the end of the Cantabrian Wars, which ended around 19 BC, there was still a Roman military presence with many forts in this area of Galicia. And this new evidence suggests that even though the war had officially ended, there was still fighting and Roman conquest going on after this date, going right until into the period of AD as well. Despite the fact there was likely still fighting going on in Galicia and some of the neighbouring regions with the newly conquering Romans, it was true that the Romans had now technically conquered the entire peninsula of Iberia and incorporated it into their empire. Now, as I've mentioned, there were already two provinces beforehand. These were largely based off the areas that the Romans had taken from the Carthaginians following the Punic Wars. These were Hispania Citerior and Hispania Ulterior. But following their conquest of the entire peninsula, they decided to shuffle things up and change these into Hispania Tarraconensis, Hispania Lusitania, and Hispania Baetica. But around 293 AD, they decided to have another reshuffle, and two new provinces were added into the mix. In the south and in the east, you got Hispania Cartaginensis, whereas in the region of modern Galicia, as well as some of the neighbouring areas stretching further south into what's now Portugal and across into Leon, Asturias, and a few other areas of modern-day Spain, you got Hispania Gallaecia. And this Hispania Gallaecia became the new province in this region. And it's important to remember about this province that it is indeed bigger than modern-day Galicia, even though it gave it its name. However, despite the fact that it was larger, it was also split into several conventus, which were these smaller divisions within the province. And these were the conventus of Bracarensis, Lucensis, and Asturicensis. And these really were named after the three most important cities. In the north, Lucus; in the south, and today, Braga; in Portugal, Bracara; and Asturica, which today obviously is named after the tribe, the Astures, and today gives its name to Asturias, the modern-day province in Spain. And I want to look at one in particular, which is Lucus, because this is still today Lugo in modern-day Spain. And Lucus, the name, actually was often referred to in Roman times as Lucus Augusti, because it was, as I mentioned, conquered and established during the reign of Emperor Augustus. And actually this Lucus name isn't a Roman one at all, it's simply a Latinization of Lugos, and Lugos is the name given to a Celtic god. And what's interesting about this is that it contains the etymological element of Lugh, and this can have several different meanings. Potentially it means black, sometimes it means to break, and other times to swear an oath. This was an incredibly important god in the Celtic pantheon, perhaps one of the most important ones up there, and there are several inscriptions that have been dedicated to this god Lugos throughout Spain. And as you can see, there is indeed a cluster around the region of Galicia, and specifically Lugo as well. Lugos in his various incarnations has also given his name to various different places in Europe today where we know that the Celts lived. Some of these are in France, like the very famous Lugdunum, which today is Lyon, as well as Luguvalium, which is today Laon in France. And even there is Loudon in Scotland. There was a famous battle fought at Loudon Hill. This is also thought to have come from Lugdunum. And there is even Leiden in the Netherlands. Hey, that's mentioning the Netherlands, isn't it? That means we've got to do the song now. The god is also known from later Celtic mythologies, such as that of Ireland, where he is called Lugh Lámhfhada, or that in Wales, where he is called Lugh Lámhfhada. What's interesting about these stories is that they give us more information about the kind of Celtic god that Lugos was, but we don't know how much of this are later and specific inventions to Wales and to Ireland. What is interesting is that one of the inscriptions dedicated to Lugos found in Spain at Osma gives an idea that he was related to shoemakers in particular. And we also read in the Mabinogi, which is a collection of stories from Wales from the early Middle Ages, that he was particularly connected with shoes being placed in people's graves, and that this seems to have been a custom that was related to Lugos. What's also interesting is that he's often referred to in the plural, and especially with 3 different sides or faces, and this can be seen in depictions of him from the period where he is shown as having 3 faces rather than just one. It's also thought that the 1st of August was a very important date for those who worship Lugos, and still in Ireland there is a festival called Lugnasadh, to use the modern Irish pronunciation, that is named after him and often means something like the Festival of Light. We again see the 1st of August as a date coming back when we look at the consecration of the Temple of the Three Gauls in Lugdunum, which was of course named after the god and was also done on the 1st of August. What's interesting is that attempts have been made to link him with the Lugos with the Roman god Mercury, especially because of their emphasis on shoes, which were important for Mercury, who obviously had winged sandals, as well as that of birds, of auguries, as well as to the tree of life, mistletoe and wolves. Now those of you who are probably more in the Germanic sphere and interested in those religions will be saying, hold on a minute, but that sounds a lot like Odin, and in fact a connection has been made between them as well, and an interesting theory, which I don't have time to go into here but I can look into at another time, suggests that it's because of migration era Germanic tribes that crossed over into Roman Gallia and then met with Celtic peoples, actually adopted this idea of the god and changed it somewhat, maybe mixed it with another of their own gods, and that is where the idea of Odin with all his epithets came from. Although currently that is just a theory, I thought it was a very interesting one. So the city of Lucus Augusti first arose as a Roman camp when they pushed north of the rivers and into the region of Galicia, but eventually this Roman camp was itself transformed into a fully fledged Roman city with many thousands of inhabitants. And around 270 AD, it was given its very own set of stone Roman walls. This was largely to protect it from some tribes in the area that were still hostile, even after centuries of the Romans being there, which gives an indication of the kind of terrain and people they were dealing with, as well as several incurring Germanic tribes, some of whom, as I mentioned, were travelling across the Roman Empire during this time, given the weakened state of its frontiers. Now what's amazing is that, as you can see in this picture, the Roman walls walls still survive to this day, and they're the most complete set of Roman walls in the world, and they still surround the vast majority of the city, which you can see today and which you can walk over if you are to visit the city of Lugo. What's amazing is also that around 49 of the towers that the Romans constructed still survive. If you compare that with what exists at Hadrian's Wall, where the wall is almost, in many parts, especially more towards Newcastle, disappeared. This is really an amazing feat, considering that it's in literally surrounding a city, although maybe that makes it more useful for the inhabitants. And this is also why in the year 2000 it was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and this continued reminder of the Roman presence here has also made it the ideal site for a reenactment festival, which happens every year in the summer months. It's called Arde Lucus, which means burn Lugo, but of course, don't worry, none of the city actually gets burned, but there are many thousands of reenactors that come to the city from various groups that portray both the Romans, who of course were essential for Lugo being built as a city and the army camp, as well as some of the civilizations that lived in the area before the Romans arrived, and which I've talked about in previous videos. It's a really great festival to go to. I'm really hoping to go there myself next year, given all the restrictions and things. But if you get the chance, then definitely do put the dates in your diary for next summer to go and take a look at the festival, try some of the food, join in with some of the reenactments, and see these amazing city walls around Lugo for yourselves. But for now, that is it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed this video looking at the Roman conquest of Galicia, looking at the foundation of the very important city of Arde Lucus, later just becoming Lucus, and of course today still being known as Lugo, and looking into some interesting facts about this god Lugos or Lugos of the Celtic pantheon, because I know a lot of you are interested in looking at these old gods and goddesses, especially from the Norse side, which is what I know more about, but it was interesting to also delve into some Celtic religion, because when I asked in a few polls, many people said that they were interested in looking at more things to do with the various Celtic peoples and their pantheons, etc. Do let me know if you want to see more videos on these kinds of topics in the comments below. That's a great way of making sure that I'm making the kind of videos that you're finding interesting and would like to watch. And if you get the chance to, do check out the festival at Arde Lucus. As I said, I'm definitely going to try to be there myself, and I think it will be a great opportunity to see some of the things that I'm talking about in the videos actually taken out in real life and seeing them in front of your own eyes. But for now, I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History.